All right, thank you, Nate. And welcome back, everybody, or welcome for the first time, those of you that have never been here. My name is Mike Southern, and we're going to go through an hour-long demonstration here. You are welcome to follow along with what I'm doing. Today's is a little bit different than some others, but I'll tell you how that works in a moment here. But the first thing that I want to do is go over the supplies that you'll need. They should have been posted on the website, but I'll just run through them fairly quickly here. So let's have a look at that not that one, this one here. So the watercolors. I've got this little artist loft set that I've been using, and it's got 24 different colors in it. That's way more than you need, honestly. But if you've got the 3 primary colors and a couple of earth tones, yellow ochre and raw umber are my preferred ones. But if you've got sienna, burnt umber instead of raw umber, all of those will work. So just have a few colors on hand. I'm a big believer in sort of a limited palette, just sort of keeping things simple, and you can mix colors as you go along. If you need something a little bit different, greens and purples and things like that can be mixed from your primaries. So that's the supply list. And what I want to show you real quick, let's just go, let's go here first. So we're going to be working on this in the beginning, but I'm also going to be sort of going back and forth because I want things to dry, and then I'll switch over and show you some technical stuff about the demo that we have here. But if you want to take a quick little gander at that and do a little sketch on your page, I'll just talk here a little bit. So if you want to, you can see I've got like a square piece here. This is about 8 by 8 or 9 by 9. It's fairly modestly sized, so it doesn't have to be big. This is more about technique. I'm not, we're not doing a master copy or, anything terribly dramatic. It's a fairly simple one. So if you want to just sketch this out while I'm talking here, you can go ahead and do that. The person that we're going to be looking at, the artist that we're going to be looking at, is Andrew Wyeth. I'll leave this up on the screen for you to kind of follow along. Simple line drawing like this is more than enough. So Andrew Wyeth, who I'm going to show you in a minute or two here, he was an American artist, 1917 to 2009. So he's fairly contemporary, only just passed away, a decade or so ago, and known for really a wide range of subject matter, done in, broadly speaking, kind of a realist mode. And I'm going to show you a few slides here. If you didn't get all of this down, that's no big deal. You'll have a few moments to do it as we go along. But let's switch over to the little slideshow here. You'll get a chance to come back on that. So this is Andrew Wyeth. This is probably his most famous painting. This is called Christina's World. It is actually not a watercolor, but based on the way he worked, it could have been. He could have executed this in watercolor. And as I go through these, you'll see sort of a pattern in his work where there's really intricate kind of a mosaic of marks that he uses. This painting was done in a medium called egg tempera, and it's kind of rare to see it. But basically what it is you mix the pigment, your colors, which is in a powder form, and you mix it with an egg yolk. And that sort of creates this creamy, watercolory, like you could, I guess, conceivably put it in a tube. They don't sell it in tubes because eggs don't last very long, and it's a bad thing when they go bad. So you have to kind of mix it yourself. So it's egg yolk mixed with pigment. And the thing about this is you have to work really thin. Otherwise it kind of clumps up and, turns into a lemon meringue pie if you're not careful, if it gets too thick. And it dries really, really fast. And so Andrew Wyeth learned this. I think this painting, this is at the Art Institute of Chicago, if I'm not mistaken. or maybe the Museum of Modern Art. I can't remember, but it's in a pretty prominent American museum. I think it's in Chicago, but I don't know. Somebody check that out for me, report back. And he learned this technique very early in his career, and it's sort of the one. It's a constant that you'll see throughout his is this egg tempera. When you see tempera, Wyeth was one of the ones who was doing it when nobody else was, or not many people were doing it. And when he started doing watercolors, he started doing watercolors in sort of a traditional way. And then as he progressed, he started using the watercolor very similarly to the way he used the tempera, sort of these really fine marks and very detailed, and with a dry brush technique. And I'm just going through here a few portraits of his from various places around the country. And if you can notice here, I've got this last slide I've got is really good for seeing the detail, but everything else that I've shown you right now are watercolors. So you can see the similarity between Christina's world, that first one I showed you, which was an egg tempera, and all these other ones, which are in watercolor. They're very detail oriented, a lot of texture. And this is a very famous series of his, the Helga series he did of his neighbor in Pennsylvania over the course of like 15 years or so. In secret, it was a bit of a scandal. And did a few still lives, but known primarily for landscape and portraiture. But we're going to be sort of taking his approach and applying it to our little pepper picture. And then here's a really good one to look at. And so think watercolor. Think if you've been here before, you know, I've sort of worked in this kind of splashy, a little bit more expressive style. This is a completely different approach. These really fine, wispy marks, you know, individual strands of hair and things like that. I was going to sort of maybe do a copy of something like this, but we only have an hour, not 6 months. So we wouldn't be able to do something like this in the time allotted. But this is kind of where we're coming from in terms of our approach today. So it's a very different way of working with watercolor. And I just wanted to introduce it as kind of the yin to the yang of the wet into wet approach, which I've done earlier. So that hopefully should give you an idea of what we're getting into. There's our pepper here. And we're going to, in a moment, I'm going to get down here and block that pepper in. I've already got the drawing down, as you saw, but I'm just going to put in some really big color shapes, and then I'm going to let it dry, because doing the dry brush technique, this more intricate work with your brushes, requires, or is best suited if your paper is dry. So we're gonna kind of skip back and forth between things as we move along here. All right. So speaking of which, let's begin. And I've got a range of brushes here. This is the same batch that I had yesterday. I've got this big Filbert here. It's I don't know, probably about a size. Let's see what we got each. Probably about a size. Yeah, so they go down. Sometimes, like, the bigger the number, the bigger the brush. It's actually kind of opposite for other ones, but this one is sort of in that traditional way. This is probably about a 10 or a 12, but you can see how big it is. It's pretty big in terms of the size that I'm using. And then these other two, everything else is smaller than that. So it's like a 12, an 8, and a 6. And then this one goes down to a 1, and it's really fine point and very long bristles. And then this one is the smallest one. I think it's a 0 or a 00. I can't remember exactly what. But they're all watercolor brushes. I have some other backups, because when you're doing this technique, it's kind of, you're making the marks. You're not letting the water kind of spread the mark for you. So it's good to have a little bit more of a variety of brush sizes if you have them. If you got something like this, you're perfectly fine. This is probably all I'm going to use, but I got a few on the side that are ready to go. Okay, so like I said, I want to just start by blocking in big, bold color shapes here. So I'm going to start with our sort of typical wet into wet and just get a lot of it established early. So I'm putting a little bit of just regular water down, and I'm just going to take a kind of a mix of maybe an umber over here. You can't really see that very well. There we go. So a little bit of umber and a little bit of blue, just to kind of make a dark. I like to mix my what would be considered a black, just because it gives me a little bit more control over how it works. And I'm just going to sort of lay this in here roughly. Once again, I only wet those areas where I want this color to go. It's not going to spread into the pepper because I didn't wet that area. And it just sort of controls where everything stays or goes or runs into. And I'm not being too concerned about being, just completely in control of my color here. Put a little blue, got a little brown, sort of letting them mix and blend a little bit. So maybe I'll do a little more brown up here, sort of get a little variety. I didn't mention this in the beginning, but this paper is watercolor paper, as it always should be when you're using watercolors. I mean, for obvious reasons, but sometimes you see like a big piece of sketch paper and you go, oh, I wonder if that'll work for watercolor. It'll sort of work, but it's not ideal. Watercolor paper is built for this medium. All right, now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm not going to pre-wet this one down here because it's not quite as big, but I'm just going to block in this shadow. Just color by number at this stage. And not trying to make it too dark. Just establishing the general kind of configuration of colors and shapes and things like that. So something like that for the darks is a good place to begin. And then for this next bit, I am going to pre-wet it. And I'm going to really try and make my edges so they don't bleed into each other. It's not the end of the world. It already started up there. You can sort of see it creeping in. It's not the end of the world because we're going to come in later with much more intense color. So it'll sort of overwhelm any little mistakes. And I'm keeping the stem here dry because that's a different configuration altogether. And it's generally in spots lighter than right here. One thing that I didn't do that I forgot to do, that little highlight, that's a good one. The paper towel here is a nice feature. And I'm just going to blot that out because I want that whole area there to not be red. I want it to read as the white of the paper. So I'm going to keep that separate. And then I'm just going to take a straight red. This is the same palette that I used yesterday. And if any of you were here yesterday, it was kind of a mess. So all I did is just went over to the sink and kind of ran it through. And I have a much clearer sense of, what actual colors are where. So I'm just going to start with kind of this rinsed out red. So this is cadmium red, I believe, cadmium red medium, but any red, any bright, brilliant red will be fine. And once again, I'm just trying to kind of establish the red shape of the pepper, not worrying too much about getting it exactly right. This is just to kind of get ourselves established
Can I jump in with a quick question real quick?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So we did receive a question saying if you're dry brushing, why wet the paper? And that, if I understand correctly, that's having to do with the to prevent the paint from spreading outside of an area that you don't want it to. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah. And all I'm doing here is we're going to do I'm not doing dry brushing right now. I'm going to be doing dry brushing after this dries. I'm going to come in here with a much more detailed approach. So I am using kind of a technique that I've used in the previous demonstrations just to establish the shapes and the overall values. So this is I debated whether to do this or like to do this ahead of time or to do it on, you know, kind of on site so you could see it. And I kind of erred on the side of I feel like people need to see this so that they know that putting something down and then walking away from it is part of the process. So your goods, whoever asked that question, you picked up on the fact that I'm not really using dry brush right now. But I'm doing sort of the block, you could call it the block-in stage. And then I'm going to let this sit and then we're going to come in. And I'm just putting a little bit more pigment on this side here. Because this is going to end up being a little darker. So.
And we did have kind of a follow-up to that question, if that's all right, from AJ, who asked, when or how do we decide to select wet on wet or wet on dry technique?
It really is, it depends on, you know, what you're after. I mean, if you're painting water, like, you know, a river or something like that, that's very much like water sort of moving. Wet and wet makes perfect sense. You know, Andrew Wyeth, on the other hand, was just used to working in this very tight, controlled manner. And so that was just a natural way for him to work. Either are valid, and you can do a watercolor with a mix of both. So it really, by the time you've done a few of these and you know, you're sort of feeling a little better about what you're doing and how you're doing it, you can kind of make a little executive decision about how things are going to play out for you. But it should depend on the effect you're after, and your, I mean, for lack of a better word, your temperament, how you like to work. All right, so now I'm just going to block in. This needs to be a little bit more yellow, or a little bit more green, I should say. So I'm going to add a little more blue. And this is just blocking in the stem. I'm getting a little bleeding in here, but that's going to be fine because I'm going to be able to come back with kind of some heavier color later. All right. And then that little bit in the front is almost pure yellow, so I'm going to keep that. Yeah, it's kind of bleeding a little bit everywhere. All right, so I think, let me just throw in some of this red in here. This is going to bleed. It's going to look a little ugly, but we'll come and clean it up later. Famous last words. Okay, so I'm going to let this sit. I've got the basic configuration set up. Red pepper, dark background, dark here, green and yellow in the stems, and then I'll come back later. So I want to show you now is I'm going to move this out of the way. So we're going to let this dry. We're just going to let this dry kind of in this state. This will probably take about 10 minutes to dry thoroughly. I didn't use a ton of water. So what I want to do now is, if you remember yesterday, this was what we were working from. I can actually pull it up here in a minute, but this is my hard copy of it. This is the painting that I did. So I'm going to sort of use this as a little bit of a demo plate, but I want to show you what we're talking about when we talk about dry brushing technique. So dry brush, one, you're not pre-wetting the paper. So the paper is dry. And if it does have water in it, it's very, very close to being dried out. It's not the end of the world if there's a little bit of moisture on there, but no, if there's any water on the paper, whatever mark you make into that, it's going to spread. And this is more about sort of tight control. So, getting the ratio of water to pigment established is pretty important. And having a rag kind of on hand is a really nice way to work here. So I'll just show you, I'm just going to kind of load this up with a nice dark mark. This was the same exact color I was using. It's kind of thinned out. So I'm just kind of loading it up here. And I'm just going to make a mark on this little scratch piece. I recommend that you have like just a kind of a scrap piece to practice this on, because, if you have too much water, if you have, too much pigment, there's lots of things that can make it not ideal in terms of your mark making. So this is just that mark with a fair amount of water on it. Okay, so let's just get a little closer on there. So about something like that. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my rag, just get rid of all the water, go back again, sort of load it up again, and just kind of get most of that off. So the mark is there, but your pigment load, or how much stuff you're transferring on here, it just makes for a lighter mark. So the water is what carries the pigment. And if you have less water, you're going to have less pigment. And there's ways of controlling that. Now, the next mark that I'm going to do, so this was kind of a light mark to start with. As soon as I kind of dabbed it a little bit, dabbed it on here, it became a lighter mark. And now I've pretty much gotten rid of most of the water here at all, and you'll see that there's nothing left. I've pretty much gotten all of the water off of here. So at some point you can dab this too much. What I'm going to try and do now here is get as minimally amount of, I'll just bring this over here so you can see what I'm doing. I'm just getting a little bit of pigment and just kind of trying to wipe most of it off, almost until I can barely see any marks. And I'm doing this on my little plastic tray. And I'm just trying to get to a point. You see how I went like that and then just kind of ended? That's sort of the essence of dry brush is you're just bleeding the water out of it. And you just want to be able to get these fine controlled little marks. And you can do this with different amounts of pigment here. So I'm gonna go over to the red. So it gets a little more dramatic. And I'm gonna load this up. And this is a much more concentrated. I mean, you can see that's got a lot of pigment on it. But I'm trying to get as much water out as I can, but still keep that heavy pigment load, if that makes sense. So this is going to be a much more intense mark. I'll just put it in between here, meaning that red is pretty darn red. And so I can get some mileage. Like when I start going back on my pepper, I'm going to be doing a lot of this, just sort of building up the intensity and kind of weaving those marks together a little bit. So we're able to get kind of a nice, even, saturated tone hue, I should say. And then you see that one looks a little bit lighter. If I go the other way, that sort of unifies the overall tone. So dry brush, another way to use dry brush that I found is like if you're creating highlights or dots on another color, like somebody, I don't know, if they're painting somebody that's got chicken pox or something like that, and you want to sort of put these little red dots all over them, you can kind of use the side of the brush and build up a little bit of a texture, or kind of goes over the top, or somebody's maybe got red cheeks or something like that, or if you're doing like a dirty field and it's got a little bit of red in it, a little bit of brown. You can kind of weave it together. So I'll just take that red. I'm just going to get a little brown on there. Maybe a little bit of yellow. This is all with fairly low amounts of, move it back a little bit so you can see what I'm doing. So I'm just taking some of this brown right here. Not a lot of water here. So now I just want to kind of maybe weave some of this. And if you look at that's probably a little, yeah, there we go. That's better. So that red is kind of peeking through that. And if you look at, if you ever get the chance of seeing a Wyeth painting up close, you'll see this kind of, it almost looks like it's woven, the color. So something like that. Let's get a closer view of that. There we go. So you can see some of these little red spots coming through the brown spots. So you're getting this interaction of color in a very kind of textural way. It's not the typical bleeding of one color into another that we've been concentrating on, or watercolor is really known for. It sort of creates this weave of color, which is very different. And the only, the distinguishing feature here is your paper has to be dry in order for this to work. And if I tried to do this and this paper were wet, it would just bleed into one continuous little wash. So it's a little bit difficult. It's impossible to do this when the paper is wet. Okay, so that's kind of the idea of the mark making here. So just to give it another minute or two for our pepper, just going to check it. It's still slightly damp. So I'm just going to bring this over here. I'm going to have to go way back now. And we'll bring this in here. Focus up. There you go. Good job. So I've got my little, oh, and watch this. Very proud of this little moment. I've got the other one underneath it. Let's move this. Oops, don't want to do that. Let's get rid of that. And then we'll bring the other one up. So I'm just going to do a little bit of a show and tell here with the one that we did yesterday. So there's a lot of detail in here. And actually, I'm going to bring this in closer so you can see it. So I did a little bit of work yesterday on this after we left. I'm going to have to put my glasses on for this. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my brush, go over here to my palette. I'll just do it right on top here. Get a little bit of water, and I'm going to kind of mix up a nice dark, a little bit of that, a little bit of umber and ultramarine blue, and really, load it up with pigment, really make it dark, but not a lot of water in here. And this is going to be an instance where I'm going to want even a smaller brush. So I did let's just try it like this. Let's see how it goes. So I'm really going to, you can really get that detail. If this were, like I said, if this were wet, this would not be working right now. Sort of just pop that waterfall out a little bit. And the area that I really want to work on is in here, because if you look at this is the picture, there's a lot of really nice texture in here. And mine does, it has a little bit of it, but I want to try, and I'm going to try it actually with a bigger brush because I want to get a fair amount of coverage. So it doesn't have to be super tiny marks. I'm going to use this big brush here, and I'm just going to basically do the same thing I did with that small brush and sort of create this dark, pretty heavily pigmented, saturated color. Not too brown, not too blue, sort of right in the middle, just nice and dark. There's a little bit of, I even threw some actual black in there. So, you know, there's no right or wrong color. It just needs to be dark. And I might be manipulating this. And I'm just going to try that color. And first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of get rid of a little bit of the real heavy pigment and just kind of tighten up this edge on the bottom in different areas. And getting it so it's not too heavy. And I'm going to try, actually, I'm going to try first on my little test. I'm going to be a do as I do, not as I say kind of person. And I'm going to see how this looks.
While you're doing that, we did have a couple questions come through here.
Yeah.
Somebody asked if you had a specific paper brand that you liked or preferred.
Uh-huh.
And then okay, yeah, answer that one first, then we'll go.
Yeah, I'll just answer that one. With paper, it is truly you get what you pay for. And paper makes a difference. Really good paper like Aquarelle, which is I forget Aquarelle is the name of it. Sort of a French. It's Arches. That's the name. Arches Aquarelle is a really good watercolor paper. Anything by Fabriano is a good watercolor paper. They cost more, but they take pigment better. They don't break down as quickly. So I naturally like to use good materials. That's not to say that like a Strathmore or a Canson or sort of a more lower priced version is not going to do the job for you. You know, if you're not a good painter, you're not going to make good paintings on good paper. I would say as you're learning and, you know, you're sort of roughing through the preliminary stages of learning a new medium, definitely buy stuff that's cheaper. The Canson, Strathmore brands fit that bill. So it really should depend on what you can afford, where you are, you know, how good you are, how comfortable you feel with the medium. And, you know, that should let that be your guide. I would say.
Yep, that's excellent advice.
I don't have one that's kind of overwhelmingly awesome. Once it gets to a certain price point, they're all pretty good. All right. So what I'm doing now, what is the other question? Sorry, I got into my little thing.
No, that's perfectly fine. No worries. Darlene is having a little bit of issue with her pigment. So she says that she always seems to get too much pigment. She ends up with a totally soaked watercolor paper, but her washes still end up too dark. Does she have paints with more pigment, or is it just too much paint? What would you think, you know, the issue might be with that Darlene could work towards?
It sounds like you just need to cut down on everything. Like a little less water, a little less pigment, and build it up slowly. You know, I think a lot of people with watercolor try to go for broke, and really just try and get a little bit too much in the beginning stages. So I would encourage you to kind of start slow and thin and build it up over time, because you can build it up much easier than you can take it back. So I think that'll be a good place to start. See how that works. All right, so I'm building up some nice texture in here. This is actually looking pretty good. I'm just going to go back and load my brush up again. Again, you know, that little patch that I had established there is kind of drying out, and that's kind of what you want. Like if it's just sitting there for like 3 or 4 minutes, and it's starting to dry out, that's a pretty good sign that you're doing the dry brushing pretty spot on. I do have to get a little more water here. All right, I think we're ready to go into our pepper. Should be dried out. This painting I'm working on here is great because I did it yesterday, so it's totally dry. It's got most of the main shapes kind of established already. So yeah, that's a little bit too, so I have to kind of get rid of a little bit of pigment over here because that was a little too heavy. I'm just kind of dragging it across. See how that big mark there, that's a little bit more than I want. Maybe start with a little, sort of get rid of some more on the bottom. All right, let's see how this works. There we go. And so I'm getting a lot of mileage out of this. Like I'm not doing every little tree leaf and stuff like that. You can add that later, but I'm just trying to kind of establish an overall texture here. Once again, kind of weaving it together. Yeah, that's kind of ideally what I want. So that's already a lot more interesting than this over here. This is not, there's a lot of nice stuff that's going on here, but this just sort of adds a layer of complexity and richness to it. So, but I have friends who paint in watercolor would go, oh God, that's just too much. That you don't need to do all that extra texture, and they would never do it because they just feel like it's just a level of detail that is not necessary for watercolor, or that's just not their style or whatever. So this isn't like the right way to do it. This is just if you're looking to add a little bit more detail and texture, this dry brush technique is really good for getting that kind of approach. I'm having so much fun with this. I'm forgetting about my pepper. I don't like peppers anyway, so maybe I'm biased. All right, I'm pretty much running dry on that, so I'll just try and get all this. So yeah, that's just adding a little bit more interest, texture, overall darker value too, because this is a fairly dark color I'm adding in there. All right, so I'm just going to leave it at that. Let's have a look, see how it plays out. Yeah, so that's definitely darker than when I started. And the thing is, this is going to dry very quickly because it's already almost dry when I put it on, thus the name dry brush. I could come in with a bluer one or a greener one and just sort of build that up. The thing you want to look out for is at a certain point, if you're doing too much and if you're rubbing it too hard, then it can kind of lift things up and make it a little muddy. So you gotta sort of thread the needle a little bit in terms of how much you do here. Okay, great. Anybody have any questions about how this application works? Because I'm going to bring up the pepper and we're going to try and finish our pepper, or at least 19 minutes. I'm going to have to hustle.
Yeah, I would, while you're doing that, I would say that Kay has a really good summation of what we were doing in the chat here, which they said that I think he's using a really dry brush, put a paint on, then dab it off on absorbent paper towel. There'll still be paint, but it won't cover everything, just the higher parts of the tooth of the paper. And I thought that was a really, really nice way of putting it.
Yep, that's exactly what's going on. You're using the texture of the paper, and watercolor texture or watercolor paper usually has a very rough texture, and you're using it to your advantage here. So that's good. So what I would do if I had a ton of time is I'd probably come along and fix this edge here a little bit, get rid of this bleeding and stuff like that. But we don't have a ton of time, so I'm going to kind of come in here and work it incrementally up to the point where we're doing those really strong marks. So I'm going to just start with kind of a darker red. Let's change our image. Let's get rid of this and pull this one out. Look at that. Oh, I don't want that there. Just get rid of it. There we go. It's a little red dot, but that'll be fine. All right, so I'm not pre-wetting anything. I might if I had more time, but we don't. So I'm just going to sort of mix up kind of a nice darker color here and just really try and define the shape. So being very kind of heavy-handed in terms of the approach we've been taking. So I'm just trying to kind of define that edge and using that kind of edge of, and this needs to come out a little bit more, of where that shadow starts as kind of my guide point. I mean, if you wanted to do something like, do a little line here and do that.
We do got a little bit of blurriness going on, if you wouldn't mind just trying to refocus the camera.
Oh, yeah. How's
That's
that?
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thanks. I was not even looking at that, so that's good. Just building that up. And then down here, and you can see I've already lost, see how dark it was up here? I'm losing it as I go down. So I just want to, in these early stages, using probably a little bit more water. So I'm just mixing up kind of a dark red and sort of adding a little bit of blue to it. Fairly good amount of pigment, but still also a fair amount of water. So let's see here. Pay attention to I've actually got the pepper here. I'm trying to use both. If you have the inclination to work from life, that's a much better way to learn. It's better for your drawing skills when you actually have to translate a two-dimensional object or a three-dimensional object into 2 dimensions. All right, so I'm going to do this as well. And there's a little bit of a lip here that's got a little bit of a highlight. So I'm just going to separate that. So you can see there's really the bleeding issue has kind of gone away now. There's no green bleeding into the red or anything like that. It's all behaving itself nicely. This is more, people that have done oils or acrylics are probably more used to this kind of painting or style or approach or however you want to call it. I'm just going to work my way out from here. There's no way we're going to get this entirely done. But I mean, the essence of what we're doing here is I'm working from big marks now, big shapes to small shapes. So I'm not going to get in, like if you were to look at the detail of this, there's lots of little kind of almost pores in the skin of the pepper. I'm not going to be able to get into that. We are doing another watercolor demo on Friday and Saturday. So I may bring this along and sort of show you what I do if I go back and fiddle with this a little bit more, which I inevitably do. I can't resist. So I'm also trying to keep any of these highlights, like right along here, there's sort of a secondary highlight. I'm trying to keep those intact. Let's see here. Let's do this. And if you feel like you need to kind of open one area, like this is dry. This was like one of my first marks. You can kind of open it up with a little bit of water and kind of, I just dabbed it in there. Just a little bit of water like that. And you can kind of open this back up and kind of connect these two areas by bringing that kind of active water into another area that's maybe dried and kind of reactivate it and get some of those highlights going. Now I'm just trying to connect these a little bit. But once again, the paper is always dry on this. So for all of you hyper detailed people that love to kind of get your meditation in, working like this is really up your alley.
Well, some good news here, Mike. You got some fans. Some people are very
Oh,
excited to hear that you have a couple of classes coming up soon. Could you
yeah.
drop those the titles of those classes so they know what to look out for?
Yeah, they're both watercolor based. So right now, this is the third watercolor class that we've done in this series. And on Friday is number 4 and Saturday is number 5. And that'll be the last two in the series. And they will be, it's called Watercolor 101, part 4 and 5. And they will involve, working with salt and creating all kinds of textures and doing all sorts of, kind of fun technical additions, sort of beyond a brush and, a brush and water. It gives you a little bit more technical approaches. So it'll be Friday, same time, Friday and Saturday. And thank you for your support. So now I'm just coming back and maybe darkening the darker areas a little bit more. It's kind of layering it. Let's see, that one gets pretty dark right in there. Very, very different approach to watercolor than we have explored thus far. And I like to have little, if I'm doing watercolor, I'll have little passages where it'll be really detailed and kind of a lot of dry brush stuff going on, and then it'll be more splashy in other areas. So, you can mix and match. It doesn't have to be like, oh, every mark has to be this, this tiny little intricate weave to it. You can kind of combine them a little bit. All right, now let's see what else. Let's do a little bit more of a watery. I want to bring this over here. This is really tricky because there's lots of kind of these secondary highlights, like a little highlight kind of in this area and all along here. So you got to watch out to kind of keep those separate. So I am using dry brush in the sense that my paper isn't wet, but I haven't really kind of embraced that little tiny weaving approach. So I'm sort of still in the preliminary phases of it. But you saw when I was doing the landscape that we had started, you kind of saw where I was getting to with that. So what I encourage people to do is if you want to post these, if you have an Instagram page or whatever, just hashtag them with like Michael's classes or Make It with Michael's. I think there's a few others that are in the chat section. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Nate. But there's ways of other people kind of checking in on your work if you want to put it up somewhere where you do that sort of thing.
Yep, you hit it right on the head too. Hashtag Make It with Michael's or hashtag Michael's classes.
Yep, there you go. I was listening. Okay. So what I did there is I kind of I went darker, but I took the blue out and went a little bit more red. If you look at that little highlight right under there, it's kind of a nice warm saturated red. So I think I'm going to take some more of that and kind of build it up. Kind of goes around the bend a little bit. But now that it's dry, now that this is dry, it sort of keeps it separate, which is kind of nice. So I've got that nice hard edge, which I can then, let's see if I can get a case where I can actually do that. So what I would do probably next is maybe try and integrate this transition a little bit more. I'm just using a straight, really saturated red wherever I see it. Kind of comes right along this. And maybe bring a little bit of that in there. A little bit right there. yeah. So you can see how it's kind of building. I'm sort of working from side to side. This is another thing that's a little different from the other ways that I've shown people with watercolor, is you kind of work from little section to section and kind of work your way across an image. Whereas before I would say, all right, just move around a lot, do a little bit of this, do a little bit of that. You don't want to have this wet and then start going here and then have them bleed into each other, and you kind of ruin all the work you've just established here. So you got to be a little bit more strategic about how you approach things. So I've got a nice little. That's probably the biggest mark you'll make in drawing with dry brush technique. Now it's a little bit more purple. I'm gonna kind of bring this. There's a little bit of wet into wet going on right now, but that's not the end of the world, because it is a very gradual transition where I'm working. So, it's not, you don't have to, oh, I didn't do it the dry brush way. It's like the image is more important than how you execute it. Just do it in a way that makes sense and gets you to where you want to go. So here I'm working with the contour of it, like the way it's kind of rolling around in space. Doing it like this might be good, but it wouldn't really be keeping with the kind of the textural roll of the the way it's moving through space there. Let's see what else we got here. This is actually a pretty good color. So it's sort of an in-between purple. It doesn't have as much blue in it. So I'm kind of saturating the red a little bit more. So I think I'll just kind of build this whole area up. What we got? Yeah, that's a nice kind of little bleed from one area to another there. Peppers are hard to paint. There's a lot going on in a pepper. And they're good for you. There, let's build that sort of in between red. A little bit more of that blue. And then when I get to the point where I'm going to start doing smaller marks, I'm in this one, I'm just making sort of big swaths of color across here and probably a little bit more water. And then as I get, towards the end of this, I will probably be using less water, more pigment, and smaller marks. So it's this gradual transition from big areas to small areas, big marks to small marks. Doing a little wet into wet, because that's actually what I want to do at this stage for that particular area of the pepper. Honestly, I think this may be my first pepper ever. I'm not a regular pepper painter. All right, what else we got here? Yeah, so you can kind of see it kind of taking shape a little bit. I'll put a little bit more of this darker edge here, and it's still wet, so that's perfect because it kind of bleeds up into that area where I want it to. Let's get a little bit of this happening over here. All right, let's get into this lighter area. Oh God, it's 12. It's almost 8, isn't it? Let's just do a quick little wash here.
While
So
you're doing that. Oh yeah, go ahead.
What's that?
I was gonna say, while you're doing that little bit of a wash, we did have some, just in case we didn't have time to get to it, because I know we're running low on time. So people interested to hear about how you're going to clean up that bleed through that's at the top there of the pepper
This
that
one
bleeds
here?
into the background. Yes. Yeah.
Oh, I'm just gonna cover it up with darker paint. I'm not gonna do anything terribly exotic or breathtakingly innovative. It's just gonna be, this is all very light paint, so it's gonna be really easy to deal with that. Why don't I do that as my final motion so you can see, because I think it's all pretty dry up there. So I'll just go ahead and do that. Nice dark blue, like dark brown. Watch it go away. Just make sure if you do this, that everything up on top is dry, because it will just bleed into your pepper. I could have pre-wet this, but I just wanted to do it really quick. Let's see that nice hard edge is back again. It's in good shape. All right, I'm gonna stop stop my portion of it anyway, and maybe a couple people can show their work if we want to. We're right up against it, but that's fine. So there, you can see where it's going. I mean, this part is all looking pretty defined, and I would probably darken this area, and then of course this is going to get darker, and then this is going to get lighter. I'll fiddle with it a little, and for those that want to see it, maybe on Friday I can give you a little show and tell. But let's see what other people are up to. So Nate, maybe there's a few people that got theirs up, and they want to show us what they got.
Yeah, let me
Or do a little of this.
yeah, let me flip through some here.
If you got a lot of paint on there,
yeah.
make sure it doesn't run down, because it will do that.
Yeah, make sure it doesn't run down. But yeah, if you want to hold up your art for a second, I'll throw a few people on the spotlight here so we can see.
Yeah, we don't have a ton of time, but want to give it. Hey, all right.
Here's Carol's looking
Looks
beautiful.
good,
So
Carol.
far.
Nicely done. Yeah.
Love it. Nicely done here. I'm gonna throw another one up here real quick.
Yeah.
Sandra, very good.
Sandra, very nice. Yeah, you're getting, I mean, everybody's basically where I was, sort of, got maybe a third of the pepper done. Yeah. Betsy, very nicely done.
Very nice.
Yeah, keep experimenting with those reds too. I mean, I put, hey, Sarah, how are you? Saw you yesterday. You put yours up too. Oh yeah, that looks good. Just add some more darks in there. Get a little, yep. Dawn, very nice.
Wish we could get to everybody, but we just don't have enough time. But they all look so good. Yeah. Well, very nice, folks. That's a nice batch of work, and appreciate you hanging in there. It was a little bit back and forth there, but if you want to keep working on that, and like I said, if you want to post it elsewhere with those tags, maybe some people can check them out. Okay. I hope to see you all on Friday at 7 Central, and Saturday, if you're around for that. These will be two really technical classes, a lot of, not technical like hard, but just more like we're going to be doing salt and how to create texture with saran wrap, and working back into it with an X-Acto knife and things like that. So kind of off the beaten track, little technical fun things to do. Okay, thanks folks, and hope to see you next time. Have a great day or a great night.